You're listening to the Radio Wammo Breakfast, only on Kiwi.
Yes, Under a Bomber's Moon is a new book by Stephen Harris, a gripping story of two airmen in World War II, one in the RAF and the other in the Luftwaffe. Wellington author Stephen Harris discovered the truth about his great-uncle's exploits in the skies above Germany. He also met a Luftwaffe pilot sent up each night to hunt him down. Stephen Harris joins us on the line this morning. Good morning to you, Stephen.
Good morning.
Well, how did this journey for you start, this journey of discovery about the story of your great-uncle?
It really started back in the mid-90s when I was working in Cologne for Radio Deutsche Welle, and I received a copy of his diary from my mother, in which he described, among other things, his role in the 1,000 bomber raid on Cologne in May 1942. So here he was up in the bomb aimers compartment describing the city that I worked in as a sea of flame, and actually pointing out some of the landmarks, including the road I used to catch the tram along to work. So it kind of made me feel that there was not only a very good story from my great-uncle's perspective here, but I felt a kind of empathy, obviously, for people on the ground who were on the receiving end of his bombs.
In that time that you were working in Germany, was it a good time to be asking questions? You know, was it too soon, or was it fine?
It depends who you talk to, but the huge majority of people I spoke to were always very happy to talk about their past, so long as they felt that you were informed about it and were taking a reasonably respectful view of it. When I was there in the mid-90s, I was working for a radio station and doing feature programs about aspects of German life, including their history. And one of the programs I made was about a team of a dozen munitions experts who, even then, 50 years after the war, were working full-time, de-arming weapons that were or bombs and shells and things that were being found by farmers and in the river and all sorts of things. So really, that part of their history was still very current at the time. When I came back in a different role as a diplomat 10 years later, working in Berlin, of course Berlin, like Cologne, got a real pounding from both sides of the Allies, the Russians as well as the Americans and British, and I felt there was Berlin itself feels like it's a bit of a haunted capital in many ways. And I guess when I talked to people there, some of their tales were a little more harrowing, I think, and you had to be a little bit careful not to push too hard too soon. If you won their confidence and spoke to them over a period of weeks or months, then they would start to open up and tell you some of the more intimate details of what they'd experienced.
So you started looking at your great uncle's exploits and his story over there. How easy was it to find out information about him?
It wasn't easy, in that such a long time had elapsed since he wrote of the events, and of course he didn't survive the war, so I had never had the opportunity growing up to talk to him about what he'd experienced. There is quite a good archive of information about the events and the exploits of Bomber Command in which he served, but they tend to be rather antiseptic. They describe times and locations and so forth. They certainly don't describe feelings, and they do nothing to light up the amazing coincidences that I was able to discover in my search.
Were you finding a lot of the material and letters home from the various servicemen sort of cross-reference each other and sort of checked each other's information?
Well, I had only great uncle's letters, but through that there were a lot of names mentioned, and I did my best to try and track down any of his former colleagues who might still be alive. I did actually come across three who flew in the same squadron and in the same crews as he did, and they were actually a little too old and senile actually to be able to give me much information, but their children were very helpful, and these men, because they'd survived this very intense period of their lives, they'd kept scrapbooks and they had their log books, and they'd even talked to their own families a little bit about some of the things they'd done, and that really helped flesh out some of the most exciting episodes in the book.
At what point did it become apparent that you could tell the story of not only your great uncle, but also a Luftwaffe pilot that was basically the enemy, or was the enemy, and that potentially they met in the skies above Germany?
Yes, well, this is an interesting aspect, because in Germany, because they lost the war and because the war is associated with such a stain on Germany's history, these old veterans tend to keep their heads down. They're not really venerated in public in the same way as our veterans are. It's a bit like the sort of Vietnam experience in the United States. They tend to be pushed aside and regarded as a bit of an historical liability. But I did manage to tap into a network of former military airmen, not only from the war but from the post-war Bundeswehr as well, the Air Force, the Defence Forces there. And they would meet every month, and it was a bit like a Rotary gathering in some respects. It was good company. They'd come along, they'd swap notes, they'd have a drink, and those sorts of things. And they were really quite a welcoming group. And from that, I was able to talk to not only several of the people there, but also to pursue a very detailed series of interviews with one of them, who was really sharp as a tack and was able to tell me everything about what he'd done, 60 years before, in great detail.
What were some of the stories that really stood out for you?
I think from my great uncle's point of view, his vivid descriptions of some of his close calls, like when they were shot to pieces coming back from raiding Essen one night. It was just a miracle they survived. They were hit twice with direct hits from flak shells. They were then shot up 3 times by a Messerschmitt night fighter. They limped back over the Dutch coast. They had to ditch in the English Channel, and then were floating in a dinghy which miraculously didn't get holed by gunfire. They floated in a dinghy for 13 hours before they were picked up by an air rescue launch. And another one from the German side, I think his description of he got shot down 4 times, and his description of one night when absolutely everything went wrong that could have done, including being, through sheer skill, he managed to get his plane down. And as he was landing, he was attacked by a Mosquito fighter bomber, and they managed to get out of the aircraft. And
Wow.
Only later did they find that there was an unexploded cannon shell lodged in the fuel tank. So the fact that he survived the war itself was a miracle.
Now, often back in those days, when they wrote about these encounters and these things that happened, it didn't sound too sensational, did it? It was all very matter of fact.
I think what struck me really strongly in retrospect is that what we now would regard as being the outer limits of heroism, in those days was all part of a night's work. I mean, you'd never call it routine, but you'd certainly say that these sorts of close scrapes happen so often in that life that they didn't tend to make a huge deal out of them.
Yeah, so and redescribing these events, I mean, how do you make them seem real?
I think there are 2 things that really helped. One is that both the quality of my great uncle's writing — he was a journalist before the war, so he knew how to write — and also the fact that I had Otto Friis there with all his mental faculties, sharp as they ever were, describing the events and with amazing recall. I mean, photographic recall in many cases. It lent an immediacy to the story which really surprised me. And I think the other thing about it is that when you're on the ground in Berlin writing this thing, you can't help but feel affected by your surroundings. I mean, I could look out my window from my office at home, and there was one of the few areas of high ground in Berlin which had been created purely from the rubble of 400,000 Berlin homes.
I mean, that's the thing. I mean, even though the years are going by and the events are so long ago, the evidence still in those parts of the world is all around you, really, isn't it?
Yes, and the other thing, of course, which affected me quite strongly at an emotional level was just 2 bus stops down the road from where I lived is a beautiful Commonwealth War Cemetery. There are nearly 4,000 servicemen buried there, and most of them are airmen who died on bombing raids on the eastern cities of Germany, and my great-uncle is buried there along with his crew. So there was an immediate link, and of course as a member of the New Zealand Embassy I was there for all the official ceremonies, Remembrance Day on the 11th of November, Anzac Day of course on the 25th of April each year, and I would often bike past there and go along and pay my respects, and that was a family, personal connection to this episode.
Well, Stephen, it's a terrific yarn. It's called Under a Bomber's Moon, and it's also a terrific website as well. A great resource there, underabombersmoon.com. I recommend people checking that out. I've just been browsing that as we've been chatting, and it's so great to see a digital resource along with the book as well. Thanks very much, Stephen.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Stephen Harris, author of